Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the Ratliff Mandolins Weekly Production Diary. We're going to do something different in this week's episode. I'm going to devote this episode to the art of engraving. Now, the only thing that I engrave on a mandolin, of course, is the metal tailpiece cover. And learning how to do that has been quite a journey. And so we're going to explore, and I'm going to share parts of that journey with you in this week's episode. So come along with me as we devote this episode to the art of metal engraving on the Ratliff Mandolins Weekly Production Diary. Come along with me. I've been engraving mandolin tailpieces since almost the very beginning of my mandolin building career. Very early on, I visited with a local gun engraver, a fellow that's pretty famous for engraving almost exclusively all black powder guns, flintlocks and cap and balls and that sort of thing. And he engraved a very nice, simple, strong design in a mandolin tailpiece for me. And while he was doing that, I kind of picked his brain, and he shared with me all of the basics and a few tips and tricks of what he was doing. And he explained to me how he made his own tools and how to hold the proper tool angles and so on and so forth. And he did things in the old-fashioned way, which is simply to hold the engraver and guide it into the metal, tapping it along on the handle and driving it through the metal. This is called the chasing hammer, by the way. And the actual engraver cutting edge is made by sort of half rounded in the bottom and sharpening the face angle at the proper angle. And as you drive it along with the chasing hammer, you dig a ditch in the metal, much like a ditch right in the field, and only on a much smaller scale. And the end result, after you've carved your ditch in the metal, following a pattern and connecting all the dots, is you have a nice artistic design in a mandolin tailpiece. Now, for the last 30 years or so, I've hand engraved these tailpieces in that same old-fashioned way, with a chasing hammer and a homemade engraver, which I made out of a file, by the way. And I made the stand to engrave on, a holding plate for the tailpieces, and after locking the tailpiece or the tailpiece covers on this stand top, I tap away with the engraver and the hammer, all the while walking round and round and round and round the piece. And I've done it that way for the last 30 years. But I'm finding as I grow older that the old eyes are not as sharp as they used to be. And specifically where I seem to have the most trouble is with lighting things. I have to have the lighting just so, or I can't seem to see the details as good as I used to. So, while engraving, with all the lighting surrounding the engraving stand, as you walk around, blocking some of the light fixtures and changing the angles between the lighting fixtures and the workpiece and your eyes, I would lose the pattern altogether. I'd wander off the pattern line and have to make an adjustment after I swung around there enough to catch the pattern in the next light. Could see it again. Not a good thing. I really felt like the quality of the engraving was beginning to suffer. Nice shirt, by the way. So I decided to do something about it. Maybe I should try a whole new approach. I got on the internet and hit all of the appropriate search buttons and chased down all of the rabbit holes and found that most people engraving today wasn't doing it the old-fashioned way like I was doing it, with the workpiece being still and the engraving guy doing the spinning around. No, the engraving piece was being spun around, and the guy doing the engraving just sat still and let it spin. Now, I already have almost the perfect turntable, It's a half of an old car axle turned up on its end. It has a spin handle and a disc brake disc welded on the end of it. It's got a little tray over here for holding your tools, and it has a braking system here ingeniously made out of a pair of vice grips in case I want it to be stationary and not spin. Now all I have to do is figure out some way of holding the tailpieces. And to fix that problem, I had in my scrap metal box a chunk of 1.5 inch aluminum, which I made round, split in half, drilled some guide pins and some springs in there so that the two halves can come apart and go back together, and drilled a whole bunch of holes in the top of it. And I can slip these little pins down in those holes to adjust for the width of things, and I put a tailpiece in there and tighten everything up. Boy, we're good to go now. And a lot of problems are solved. I sit still, the workpiece itself spins, the angle between the lights here, once I get everything set up where I want it, never changes. The light, the workpiece, and my eye, I can see very clearly through the entire process. I have a good start on a workable system now. Now, I found in my many internet travels that most modern engravers are not using the chasing hammer and the engraver any longer. They're using this pneumatic driven, small palm-sized engraving machine. So I guess I have to research that as well. As it turns out, if you want to, you can buy one of these engraving machines. Or you can make one yourself. I'm certainly not a rich guy, and I felt like the store-bought versions were a little too pricey for my budget, so I decided to try my hand at making one. There are a lot of videos on the internet about making these things, but let me give you the big picture of what we're trying to accomplish before we go too far into the details. Remember the whole thing about driving the old-fashioned chisel with the old-fashioned chasing hammer? Well, the concept is basically the same. A chisel type mechanism being driven by a hammer of some sort. So while the old way had a chisel and a hammer to drive it, the new way has a mechanism that incorporates both the chisel and the hammer, and then we have a tiny air compressor to drive it. So let's tear this thing apart and I'll show you how it works first. Now, complicated as it might seem, this is actually a pretty simple machine. I have taken a regular bolt and cut the head off of it, drilled a small hole here and a big hole down here on the end. All that big hole goes down there a long way, all the way down almost. And we have a bit holder that goes in the little hole in the front. I've made my bits mostly out of 1/8 inch broken drill bits, believe it or not, and that fits right there. This collar goes on here, and its purpose I will show you in just a moment. Now down in this big hole down here, which extends all the way down to the back end of this thing, goes a simple ball bearing, a spring, and what we have here is a nut threaded to match that right there, sunk down in a piece of wood and then kind of halfway turned, a hole drilled in here so that we can slip a hose on there and get air from the air compressor. All of that goes together, and this collar tightens down on that whole mess. So what you have is the ball bearing down in there with a spring behind it, and the air will drive that ball into the back of that thing and therefore drive your chisel through the metal. Now let's take just a second to discuss this air compressor that we're going to use to power this whole mess. I bought this at one of the big box stores. I was fortunate enough to find one that would plug into your regular wall outlet. Quite often these things are designed to plug into the cigarette outlet thing in your car, and if you buy one of those, then you have to work out a whole DC to AC power converter, and it's a whole big mess. So save yourself a lot of trouble and just find one that plugs into the wall. Let's discuss what an air compressor is and what it does. An air compressor is really just a piston. It takes air from here and it pushes it this way. It sucks it in through a series of valves and pushes it that way. And it can do one of two things. It can push it into a tank and build up pressure, or it can just push it down the line, down a tube like this right here. And so it's taking air from here, pushing it there, and building up pressure. That's what an air compressor does. It's an air compressor. But that's not what we want our air compressor to do. We don't really need compressed air. We need air to push and pull on that little ball bearing that we put down in the middle of the bolt, making it jump back and forth in the hole that we have drilled in the bolt. And as it hits on the back end of the cutter bit thing here, the ball will act just like a hammer that we used in the old-fashioned way, and will drive the front of that cutter bit through the metal. Voila, we'll be in business. So, right now you're probably saying, wait a minute, that's not making any sense. How does pulling the air in here and pushing it out there, how does that make the little ball go inside the little bolt and all like that? And that's a valid question, because an air compressor compresses air, but it doesn't move it back and forth. We have to alter this air compressor so that it indeed does push the air up and down a single tube. I've got two drinking straws, plastic drinking straws, to simplify for you exactly how an air compressor works. This will be the inlet valve, the red one, and the striped one will be the outlet valve, and let's say my lungs will be the pump. What happens is you suck in air down the red straw and push it out down the striped straw. In, out, in, out. All you have to do is plug off one of the straws, and we'll plug off the inlet valve, and so that when that piston pull or pushes, it blows air out, and then as it goes back to through the cycle again, it sucks air down the same straw. In, out, in, out. So all you have to do is actually just plug off one of the straws. I'm not going to go into the details of exactly how I did that, but there's plenty of videos on YouTube about it. But you take the top off and you plug off the appropriate valves, put everything back together, and suddenly the only air movement that this compressor will cause is air coming in and out the same plastic tubing, which, by the way, is just surgical tubing that I bought at one of the big box stores, along with the air compressor and along with the bolts and the springs and the ball bearings and everything that it takes to make this system work, including the one thing that we haven't discussed yet, which is a speed control. And it's basically just, they call them router speed controls, but it'll work on just about any electric motor, and it just regulates how fast it goes, which regulates how much air gets pumped, which regulates how strong this is in case you want a hard stroke or a soft stroke and all like that. Here's the router speed control that I was telling you about. It's plugged into the wall. The air compressor is plugged into the router speed control. Out from the air compressor comes the surgical tube with our engraver and in that engraver, the air comes in, pushes the ball back and forth along the cylinders, which drives the chisel. So there's the entire system, and we'll turn it on. And I have a piece of scrap. By golly, it works. And like I mentioned before, the speed control here simply regulates how fast this motor goes and therefore how forceful the power is behind the engraver head. And I'll demonstrate. You can turn it up high or low. And you can hear the ball hitting back and forth inside the cylinder. So then you just regulate your speed by that, depending on what kind of material you've got and what bit you've got in the cutter head. Now, as much engraving as I've done over the years didn't prepare me for what I was about to tackle. I was totally shocked at how hard that thing right there was to control. I had trouble controlling the depth of the cut and the width of the cut, how smooth it was, and I honestly had trouble even just following the pattern. In fact, the first thing or two that I tried to engrave had me almost convinced that I'd wasted my time and money building something that I really wasn't capable of using. So I got pretty disappointed, but I'm also pretty stubborn. And so I thought maybe I just need to practice. You watch those guys on the internet and they just put that thing down there and they're engraving some really beautiful stuff. So I went and started digging some things out of my little scrap metal bin, some aluminum and steel and brass and bronze, and I started practicing. Oh, and I found that electrical box cover plates made wonderful material to practice with. They're cheap. You can screw them to a piece of scrap wood, engrave all on one side, ruin it if you wish, flip it over and you have a fresh surface on the other side. And like I said, they're cheap and you can pick them up at any of the big box stores. Anyway, I spent the next several weeks trying to practice a little bit every day. And I started out trying to just get a straight line. And boy, you'd be surprised how hard it is just simply to cut one straight line. And after you learn how to make one line good and straight, you'd be surprised at how hard it is to make a second line right beside the first one just as good and just as straight. And so I tried all sorts of different things. Parallel wavy lines, S-curves, circles, straight lines, 90-degree corners and rounded corners, all sorts of things that I thought would give me the skills to do the things that I needed to do in the future when I started doing patterns. And finally I did get where I felt like I was good enough to at least give a try to a certain pattern. And I fished around for things, and the Ratliff logo or a scroll of some sort, and I gave it a shot. I don't have any of those really early fiascos, but after I started getting a little bit better, I do have some of the things saved that I practiced on. Here's one of those cover plates that I was telling you about earlier. You see, where I practiced the scrolls. Here's just a piece of angle aluminum that I practiced on there for a while after I got good enough to kind of follow a pattern. Here's a couple of those logo things that I mentioned. Here again, a steel cover plate that's been polished off. Some brass stuff that I had. So you can see I was getting at least good enough to follow a line. I have this elf girl that I was pretty proud of. All of the engraved lines were pretty much where I told them to go, and they all flowed reasonably smooth with the same amount of width and depth. I feel like I was getting better. And I discovered hobo nickels, again thanks to the internet. Apparently people have been engraving on and carving on and obviously defacing coins for hundreds of years before you start thinking it's some kind of federal offense or something like that. No, apparently it's not. It's against the law to alter money so that you misrepresent its value. In other words, you can't make a quarter look like a 50-cent piece. But scratching on a coin is okay, I guess. All I know is look up hobo nickels, which is a generic term for it can be a quarter or a penny or a dime or whatever, but they always call it hobo nickels. Look it up. There's a whole lot of people doing it. Anyway, I started engraving on these coins as well. They're great, wonderful practice plates. And it's kind of fun watching the reactions you get from store clerks when they notice that you've just handed them some coins that have some pretty crazy things engraved on them. You get some really good reactions. I learned a whole lot while I was doing coins. I learned how to hold the angle of the engraver so that I could get a varying width and depth of the lines, how to start with a thin, narrow line and slowly allow the bit to cut deeper and deeper, allowing the line to also get wider and wider at the same time. That's a real good technique to give shading and floral patterns a lifelike look and feel. And as long as we're going to speak about patterns, I can't tell you how many hours I spent on the internet just looking at patterns. You got to keep in mind that the requirements are pretty specific for a mandolin tailpiece. First of all, the design, or we can call it the pattern if you want, it has to fit and fill a specific shape, the shape of a mandolin tailpiece cover plate. It has to be attractive in a specific length to width ratio. In other words, that artwork has to fit on the palette of the mandolin tailpiece. So I looked at thousands of patterns on the internet trying to find artwork that might fit on a mandolin tailpiece. I typed in everything into the search engines that I thought might give me an appropriate image, like pen and ink drawings, Celtic designs, black and white drawings, tattoo designs, Zentangles, woodcuts, wood carving patterns, horse drawings, angel art, doodles, quilt patterns, mermaids, Viking art, intarsia, coloring book images, musical note artwork, marquetry, inlays. Anyway, the point being that you name it, I looked at it, and in the end I come up with maybe 100 possibilities or so. Most of them had to be altered or touched in some way. Some of them just need to be thrown out. They weren't as good as I thought they would have been. But after the dust settled, out of that 100 possibilities, I had about maybe 20 that I had run through my artwork program and had stretched and sized and fit and everything, and was ready to see if I couldn't transfer that artwork out of my computer onto a mandolin tailpiece so I could begin engraving. So let's look at the process of how that works after you have the appropriate artwork in your computer or on a piece of paper, how to turn that into an engraved piece. And I did indeed engrave a whole bunch of tailpieces with these different patterns. Now, it is true that I went back to my traditional pattern or a variation thereof after it was all said and done, but boy, I had a lot of fun and gained an awful lot of confidence with some of these other patterns, and I'll show some of these tailpieces to you right now. As you can see, they're dragons, And the animals, a lion, an eagle, two or three different styles of Celtic crosses, and several things that were just odd, singular ideas without a theme. So as you can see, there were a whole lot of different patterns and stuff that I tried. Each one of them was a learning experience, and like I said, I got better every time I did one. Now, I mentioned earlier that I kept basically the standard tailpiece design that I had used for years and years. I altered it a little bit, and here is a photo of the final version that I kept. And there is a video of that entire engraving process on that particular tailpiece, and it is listed as the bonus footage for episode number 107, I think, and there'll be a link to it at the end of this video where you can see the entire engraving process on that particular tailpiece. There are two different techniques to get a pattern imprinted onto the tailpiece so that you can indeed engrave it. One of them is just to physically scratch that pattern on there, and when I have a standard Ratliff pattern here, I have that into a piece of plate aluminum, and I take it with a scribe and just very gently scratch that entire pattern onto the tailpiece cover surface, and then just flip it this way and do it again. And when I'm done, I have light scratches for exactly where I want that engraver to go. That's how I do a my standard Ratliff pattern. But if somebody asks me for something custom, well, that opens up a whole new can of worms, and usually they send me some artwork, or we discuss, I want a dragon, or I want this, or I want that, and then I will take that artwork that I can find or they send me and put it into a computer program that I have that will stretch it, do whatever I need to do, as I discussed before, to actually make it fit onto the palette this width and this length and this width. So once I've got that done, I can print that pattern off, size it down so that it'll fit exactly on this tailpiece cover. I have a solution that I ordered off of the internet. It's this milky white stuff, and you lightly put a coat on this cover, or any surface anyway, and then take your stuff fresh out of the printer, position everything exactly the way you want it, and then I take a spoon and just rub that onto the tailpiece, and that solution will kind of soak that ink out of the paper, and you peel that paper off, and you lightly have a pattern on to the tailpiece. It works better, they say, with a laser printer, and I don't have that. I have an inkjet printer, but so far it's been good enough for me to see what I need to do. But the pictures, the videos and stuff that I've watched on the internet, the laser printer is much crisper and cleaner, but I don't have that. So anyway, either way, you have the pattern either scratched on or printed on, and then it's time to lock the tailpiece cover into this thing. Now, you've seen these little 1/4 inch thick pieces of metal that are cut almost like the shape of a tailpiece, and I do that to keep from crushing the sides of the tailpiece when I lock it into the machine. So I have my pattern on the tailpiece cover. I've got it locked into the rotating vise, and now it's time to start the engraving process. Now, if you're wondering about that whole shading process that you're looking at, it's called stippling. I think that's what I call it anyway. And it's basically an engraver, but it has, instead of a gouging tip on it, it's just got a needle point on it. And as you can see on the video, you just kind of color it in, and it kind of just pounds a whole bunch of little holes in there, and the effect is a shading. Well, that pretty much takes care of my engraving story. If you're interested in getting into this stuff, it's really not expensive. All of those homemade jigs and things, and the compressor and the speed control that you saw, the rubber tubing and all that, I bet you I don't have $100, $125 in that whole mess, so it's not like you have to spend thousands. And there's a good community out right here on YouTube. I watched an awful lot of videos by a fellow named Sean Hughes, and another one by that was awful helpful is a guy named Rick Alexander. They both have videos on engraving, and more importantly, how to build the equipment and what you need to get everything started. So those were really good resources for that. Other than that, I'm about done. Hope you enjoyed this video, and check back with us each and every week for a brand new episode of the Ratliff Mandolins Weekly Production Diary. And by golly, I will look for you next week. Bye.